Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Behind the Meter, an MPSC podcast. We are here today with returning guest, Commissioner Alessandra Carrion. Hello, good to see you.
Hello, good to be back.
And we're also welcoming a first-time guest, the Director of the Commission's Energy Resources Division, the longest tenured employee here at the Commission, Mr. Paul Proudfoot. Hello, Paul.
Good morning.
We're glad to have you here today. Maybe before we jump in, we'd love to just get to hear a little bit more about you. Tell us about your background, what you've done here at the Commission, what excites you about this work.
Well, I'm older than dirt, and I started in '74, October of '74, and it was really a different world in many ways. All of the functions that are incorporated in the division that you named weren't regulated by the Commission at that time. The Commission up until then had never really raised rates. Economies of scale in the coal-fired industry had allowed them to continually lower rates. But both big utilities were in nuclear programs, and they were struggling with financing the build on the nuclear plants, and so they needed to raise rates. And I was hired as a data systems analyst. I only came here to get enough money to go back to grad school, and I'm still working on that. But and so I started out in that, trying to computerize the rate case process. And it's interesting that computerize at that time meant mainframes and punch cards, and I came here right out of MSU. I was MSU School of Packaging, Ag and Natural Resources. So I had a broad-based college education, at least to get started, but at that time the state tested for data systems analysts, and I tested into the top of the score, and I showed up, interviewed, and my boss made me, I had to start the next day. Showed up, started the next day, no drug tests, no nothing. So, and it's been a great ride. I mean, it seems like yesterday that I started, and you'd think working at the same place, maybe you should move on and get some experience and change your life. But here at the Commission, it's always been one, I don't want to say disaster, but one project at a time where there was just such it's just hard to look back and see the track record. I mean, initially I worked a lot on the failure in the nuclear industry, and we saw Fermi come in and doubled Edison's net rate base, doubled it. One rate case, we doubled it. Took 6 staff witnesses to get it in the rate base. I was one of the accounting witnesses, imagine that. But, and then consumers failed the nuclear plant. I mean, the Midland plant failed. They couldn't bring it online, and it nearly bankrupted consumers. So I was involved in working on the near bankruptcy of consumers. And it just seems like one thing after another.
We're glad that we've had you all these years. 50 years, a ton of experience. I'm sure we'll get to a lot of the different things that you've done during your career here. I think you've basically touched all the different industries that we do regulate here at the Commission. And so maybe to jump into the conversation today, it might be worth talking a little bit about what is it that we actually do regulate at the Commission. And so Commissioner Carrion, I'll turn it over to you to maybe talk about that a little bit.
Sure, and I guess I have to comment on just the brilliance of having the longest serving team member of the MPSC alongside the shortest tenured so far commissioner. So it'll be a nice variety we get here from the conversation. But what we regulate today are electricity, natural gas rates, conditions of service, fees, rulemaking behind that, as well as telecommunications to some extent. So what started as the Railroad Commission in the 1800s has now evolved over time, over more than a century, and exactly as you said, Mike. I think, Paul, it's really interesting to see how it's directly affected not only Michiganders, but those who work here to kind of build up that perspective, wisdom, insight around how the last 50 years shape the way we make decisions today. So that's very interesting. And I'll say also within natural gas and electricity, and again, we may get into this in the conversation, there's also siting involved in that, petroleum pipeline siting, and recently with the new clean energy laws from 2023, also renewable energy facility siting that we have authority over on a voluntary basis. So yes, it's a lot, but Paul, I think you've seen us do even more, so we'll I don't know if I'd be very curious to hear, like, at a high level, how you think things have changed outside of the commission that influence your work.
It's interesting, if you look at the division I regulate, none of the functions were at the commission when I started. You know, there was no EWR, there was no integrated resource planning, there was no renewables, there was no capacity demonstration requirements. There was no MISO. There was no Regional Transmission Authority. The utilities owned the transmission. There was no ITC / MEPC. So they were fully integrated. It's interesting too. A lot of people forget. In 2000, we went full market. You know, and then in the 2008 energy legislation, we come back and did 10% market. So that's something to remember, that 10% of the customers in Michigan are served on retail access. We don't, open retail access, we don't set the rates. So it's just, and I did spend a little time in the telephone division when we regulated telephone rates. And I was a telephone engineer, and we used to actually do cost of service field work for the telephone industry. But that was back when the offices were mechanical.
We haven't regulated telecom rates in almost 20 years, is that right now? Mm. Yeah.
So it was, you know, I worked on, you know, telephone separation studies, which are actually setting the rates. But
I imagine that is connected, that the cost of service studies, the principles behind all of these different sectors are linked. There's, even if we're not doing telephone rate regulation anymore, just interesting to think about. Do you see sort of parallels between?
Yeah, when I was in the telephone industry division here, it was all Michigan Bell. And we had 43 mom and pop telephone companies, but the Michigan Bell was like the godfather of the telephone industry, and they really ran everything. And their national association, you know, they were a holding company, and so their stuff was really complex. It's interesting to see how the failure of the nuclear industry drove integrated resource planning. People forget what the I in integrated resource planning means. It's the integration of demand-side activities, EWR, now a big component. We take it for granted. At one time, it wasn't considered.
EWR is energy waste reduction or energy efficiency that's kind of a Michigan-specific thing that we do here.
And even the IRPs you referenced, just in case people aren't familiar, that's, and to your point, the integrated meaning behind that is the planning over a longer term for these resources, for these utilities, and how they're going to meet the demand that.
So there's a couple things that I'm hearing here that are interesting, and then we maybe want to expand upon a little bit. So why does the commission exist? Why do we regulate in the first place? And I think that a lot of the industries that we have or continue to regulate tend to have, they're really big industries, they're capital intensive, they're sort of almost monopolistic in nature. And so as, basic econ, we know kind of how monopoly pricing isn't always good for consumers. So I think the work of the commission is intended to sort of substitute for competition. So that might be worth kind of diving into a little bit. Paul, you also talked about sort of the public function that's here, and these are all industries that have a public interest, right? That they're in many cases private companies, but they are suffused with providing service, essential service to the public, and so there's that characteristic as well in the work that we do. Did you talk about that a little bit, like just how those pieces fit together and how that may drive sort of, the types of industries that we do end up having some oversight of?
Well, of course, it's economic theory that monopolies left to their own devices will overcharge. So the commission serves that function, is to set a fair rate and tariff. But another thing that's often overlooked is the commission, in order to have the electric industry we have, capital has to be accrued to invest in that industry. And electricity is critical in a modern society. So if we're unable to acquire the investment in the industry, we're not going to have electricity. And it's so important that investors, when you have investor-owned companies, investors have to be assured that they're going to get their money back when they put it in the utility. And the Commission's done a pretty good job over the years, since its inception actually, in allowing the acquisition of that capital to support the system we have in Michigan. Unfortunately, we've kind of overused our distribution system, and we're going to have to move back in and do serious investment in that distribution system.
Definitely.
I was just going to say, and we can return to that point because that's a very important point, that all of this, though, is underpinned by what the authority that we do have, which is directly from the legislature. It's by statute, but ultimately everything we do, and again, we love saying this just any chance we get, as a creature of statute, we're implementing the laws that are in place. So in everything you've noted as well, those milestones are accompanied or kind of paired with public acts or laws that were passed that then sort of changed the tide, like telecom retail rate regulation that changed, was it 2011 or so years ago. But until that point, we were doing one thing. The legislature then will, with new statute, then kind of can change the direction of where we're going or how we're doing things. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of make that point for the listener that might be thinking, well, can they just do whatever they want whenever they feel like? And not really, though we do have authority, pretty broad authority to decide how we make changes or rules specifically or guide our utilities in the way they're operating. But back to...
I always keep in mind that our major statute is Act 3. I think it's 1939 Act 3, and we just keep adding it to it. The other major statute is PA 295, which is a separate statute that we keep adding to. But the original description of Act 3 is a statute to abolish the Public Utilities Commission. That was what it said. So I always try to keep that in mind, that we are a creature of the legislature, and we're only fulfilling the legislative requirements that they've laid out.
Mm-hmm.
I think another thing that's interesting as we have this discussion, certainly the legislature kind of sets the policy, and the commission is here to work to implement that. But there's also, the legislature is sort of responding to what's happening in the world. And I think a lot of the things that sort of change over time are probably in response to technological innovations in particular. And so it's interesting to kind of compare the telecommunications industry and the electric and gas industries that we still regulate today. We sort of have seen a lot of competition grow in the telecommunications space to the point that sort of the need for landline regulation is not the same as it was, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, whenever. As it relates to the electric and gas industries, it's almost more regulated potentially than it has been in the past. There is technological innovation that's happening there, and I think that's a place where the commission is sort of grappling with a lot of issues, like are there particular pieces that are true, utility functions? Are there places where competition, sort of comes to bear, and sort of dealing with some of those issues is a pretty interesting kind of question or set of questions that exists for the commission today as well. But those two regulatory tracks have sort of gone in a few different directions. So it's just technology, the policy or the legislation that sort of sets the statutory framework in place, and kind of how those things interplay with one another.
And I think that gets to the point earlier too, just in terms of the investment needed in order to not only maintain but improve this infrastructure. I think, to your point, Mike, just about like technology changes. There's technology changes, and then there's just sort of baseline. I don't even want to call it maintenance because it goes beyond maintenance, but and it's sort of where you were going before. We just interjected with everything we do is a product of the statute that guides our work. But I think you were commenting on that, Paul. Just even just the distribution system, the level of investment, capital needed, and therefore how I think, as you're saying, Mike, that maybe telecom and landline, and therefore the evolution of technology related to that went one way. When we look at electricity and even natural gas, the level of infrastructure investment required, capital, and just sort of the amount of work both at the commission, but then just globally that exists behind that, I think is sort of interesting to reflect on, just the sheer scale of investment that we're regulating, I guess.
I think it's easy to forget how important getting that first telephone was to people that didn't have cell phones. That if you lived rural like I grew up, I knew people that didn't have a telephone. You'd have to go to the neighbors to make a call. Our first line was a party line, had like 8 different customers on it. Some little mom and pop developed it. It was later bought out by TDS, but you just didn't realize how important it was to have that telephone. It's kind of like now, if you don't have good broadband service, you can't really, it's difficult to work at home without that good internet connection. So it's almost like that. Mm-hmm. But as technology replaced the landline, there's a lot of wire out there that's pretty useless now. I mean, I still have a landline. It's only because it's my internet provider, but I don't answer it. So technology just bypassed all of that investment. We saw that when computerized exchanges started replacing the mechanical exchanges. It was cheaper to just retire a brand new mechanical exchange and put in a Northern Telecom computer to manage the system than it was to pay the maintenance. I mean, those mechanical systems required 2 guys full-time to keep the contacts clean and to keep them running. And once you put the computer in, so the commission allowed write-offs of some brand new equipment, but it was the economic thing to do. Now as we look at our distribution system for electric, it's critical for customers that are looking to turn to electricity for other services. The electrification push that we're seeing, and cold weather heat pumps and electric vehicles, and we need a stronger distribution system. But I think it's kind of like, if you ever known somebody that drove their used car too long, the payments, you weren't making payments on it, so it was nice. I'll drive this. I don't like car payments. I'll just drive it. And you get used to not making car payments, and then you drive it until the maintenance is so bad that you have to buy a new one, but then you have to go out and borrow money for the down payment too. So unfortunately, that's where we are with the state's electric distribution systems. We were able to have low rates, but now it's time we're going to have to invest money in them.
And that's, I mean, a great point too. Like the work that the commission does, and the amount of investment that takes place. These investments are not short-term investments. They're intended to be in place for 20, 30, 40 years. And so, decisions that were made in previous decades have kind of led us to where we're at today in terms of the reliability of the distribution system in particular, and the decisions that this commission is making today will sort of live with current customers and generations to come. And so it's, these are really important decisions, and it's just, it has a big impact on people's lives, and they have to sort of get out of kind of the short-sighted mode and think decades ahead to be able to sort of make sure that you're doing the best for the folks that we're serving.
It's a tough job. I never understood how we're able to get such quality commissioners over the years. I've worked for a lot of great commissioners and chairmen, and my first question, I think I asked it to you, was, did the governor really tell you what's entailed in this job? I think she might have.
There are surprises
Not really.
here and there. No. But it's great. I think I think Mike, you raised a really good point, right? This question of the intergenerational nature of our work, and Paul, I mean, I would love to hear. You've already shared, but you have seen that play out. You just gave the analogy of where we have been and where we are now. But if it inspires any confidence, I think that's one of the many aspects of our work is to ensure there's proper planning in place, as to the best of our abilities, with the best information that we have today for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, as many years as everything from how we calculate the depreciation life of an asset, right, factors all of this in. So we do our best for that, and then we also do our best to adjudicate cases that, say, have 10-month timeframes. So it's a very short, mid, and kind of long-term thinking that we need to bring to this work that is necessary for the reasons you just stated. We're not only doing this for customers today, even for next year. It's to the best extent we can for the generations to come.
The accounting is very complex, and in the renewable sector, it's even more complex. The cost recovery methodology we use is very complex. It's all there. It's all standard accounting when you actually look at it, but it's complex.
Mm-hmm. And we have experts who help us with that, which is why you're an expert. I heard in telecom and electricity and mainframe computer. He
hasn't talked about his natural gas experience. At one point, he described to me how he wrote the depreciation program that people were using for dozens of years here. Paul truly has done it all at the commission during his time here. It's pretty incredible.
Well, I did have the advantage of when I came in, we had the mainframes, and to give you an idea how things changed but remain the same. Some of the first statistical analysis programs I worked on were about the cost. We were analyzing whether whether elderly people, senior citizens, should receive lower rates. Mm-hmm. So we're still doing that. Mm-hmm. And we were looking at cost impact of natural gas increases, because you got to remember, the price of natural gas was like 26 cents an MCF until in 1978 Carter floated them. So now, otherwise we wouldn't have had any natural gas, because nobody's looking for natural gas if it's only worth 26 cents an MCF. But they floated the price, so that we had difficulty absorbing that. Ratepayers and the commission was involved in analyzing that process and looking rates. But the point I was making, I came in and had a huge advantage, because I got to work with a lot of really smart people on various projects. I think now we tend to be more siloed, because we each have our personal computer, and it used to be, if you wanted to do on a computer, you had to teach me what you were doing, and then I could help you do it on a computer.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation. I'd love to give both of you an opportunity to maybe provide some concluding thoughts, anything that we should be thinking about, in terms of the MPSC's role, in terms of our jurisdiction and the work that we do. Paul?
Well, I've always been a proponent of we now call it energy waste reduction, but the best kilowatt hour is that saves the customer the most money is the one they don't use. So that's my firmly behind that, and fortunate over the years to have commissions that support that concept.
It tends to be the most cost effective too. Commissioner?
No, I learned a lot today, and I always enjoy listening to Paul. And I think what emerged in the conversation just around similarities and differences and how things remain the same but change. I think that's an important reminder even for me to, again, kind of continue doing the best we can in learning, not only from our own experts, but learning from what's happening in other states around the world, and then understanding what applies here, and implementing, changing where we can while keeping sort of that central mission that has remained effectively the same since the inception of the Railroad Commission in terms of protecting customers, but also ensuring reasonable rates. I think it's just an interesting reminder to adapt, learn, but always keep that mission sort of central to what I do, at least from my perspective. So, and thanks, Mike.
For sure. So I will just wrap up by saying, commissioners are amazing, but I'm biased, and I think what makes this place great is our staff. I think Paul is a great.
Well, I have great staff. I mean, it's unbelievable how smart. I shouldn't call them children because they're all adults, but compared to me, they were all.
Everybody's a child.
I was
compared
working
to you,
here
Paul.
before they were born, but
Paul was here when the Railroad Commission was in place.
Yeah, I have the greatest staff that you can imagine.
So we like to say here, commissioners come and go, but Paul Proudfoot lasts forever. Appreciate everybody joining us today for Behind the Meter, and encourage you to jump back in again. Look forward to talking with you all again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.